When I attended my sister's wedding, my seat was not at the head table. It was not even in the dining room. My seat was a wobbly folding chair pushed out into the drafty hallway right next to the swinging kitchen doors. My new white mother-in-law smirked at me, whispering that only the close family deserved to sit inside the main ballroom. To make it worse, I did not even have a place card. My sister Chloe just giggled and told me I probably did not count as real family anyway. So I simply stood up, grabbed the thick, heavy envelope I brought as a gift, and told them I would be leaving. Suddenly, my sister went completely pale and screamed for me to wait. She had no idea that the envelope I was holding held the key to ruining her entire fake life. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the disrespect of toxic relatives. I am standing barefoot on the sheepskin rug of my Atlanta penthouse right now, holding a glass of aged bourbon and looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline. The amber light in this room is warm and quiet, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I left behind at that wedding. My name is Nia. I am 35 years old, the CEO of a commercial real estate acquisitions firm, and I deal with cutthroat corporate sharks every single day. But absolutely nothing prepares you for the casual cruelty of your own mother and sister. The wedding was held at Sterling Manor. It is a sprawling centuries-old estate owned by the supposedly wealthy family of my sister's groom, Julian. Growing up as a Black woman in this city, I learned early on that my mother Vivian valued only one thing above all else, and that was social status. Her ultimate triumph was supposed to be tonight marrying her golden child daughter into an old money white family. I arrived wearing a custom navy silk dress, carrying myself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had built her own empire from scratch. While Chloe and my mother basked in the golden light of the crystal chandeliers inside the main dining hall, I was stopped at the entrance by a snooty wedding planner. She directed me away from the laughter and the beautiful music, pointing me toward a small table out in the dim hallway. Every few seconds, the heavy wooden doors would fly open, slamming into the back of my chair. Blasts of hot air, the smell of industrial dish soap, and the loud shouting of the catering staff washed over me constantly. They had literally seated me next to the trash clearing station. I was just smoothing out my napkin, refusing to let my face show any emotion, when Beatrice Sterling drifted out of the ballroom. Julian's mother wore a champagne gown that looked expensive, but slightly outdated, her neck heavy with vintage pearls. She stopped by my little table, looking down her nose at me with a tight, highly practiced smile. "Oh, Nia," she purred, her voice dripping with fake sugary sympathy. "I hope the noise out here is not too much for you. We just ran out of space inside the main hall and we knew you would understand your place." She leaned in slightly, letting her cold blue eyes rake over my skin and my natural hair. "Besides, that dress gives you such a striking, exotic look. It really stands out among our traditional crowd. I suppose you are used to making do with whatever you are given in life." The microaggression hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She was not just insulting my seating arrangement. She was insulting my race, my presence, and my entire right to exist in her so-called elite world. Before I could even formulate a response, my mother Vivian rushed over from the ballroom entrance. She wore a rented designer dress she could not afford, trying desperately to blend in with the Sterling family's old money aesthetic. Instead of defending her eldest daughter against this blatant disrespect, her eyes darted nervously toward Beatrice. "Nia, please do not cause a scene," my mother hissed under her breath, grabbing my wrist so tightly her nails dug into my skin. "The Sterlings are an important family. Chloe worked so hard to secure her place in this high society. You are a nobody here, so just sit down, eat your food, and do not embarrass us." I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling a cold realization wash over my entire body. She was perfectly willing to let her own flesh and blood be degraded, just so she could pretend to be part of an elite white family that secretly despised her. Just then, Chloe pranced out of the ballroom, her arm looped tightly through Julian's. Julian wore a custom tuxedo and the arrogant smirk of a man who believed the world owed him everything simply because of his last name. Chloe looked at my bare folding table and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed down the hallway. "Oh wow, they did not even print a place card for you." she giggled, leaning her head against Julian's shoulder. I guess the caterers realized you do not really count as part of the inner circle. Julian chuckled, looking at me like I was a beggar who had wandered in from the street. Just eat your food quickly, Naya, Chloe added, waving her hand dismissively. Julian's friends are coming out here later to smoke cigars, and we do not want them tripping over your chair. 10 years ago, this level of humiliation would have broken me. I would have run to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and cried while begging for their validation. But I was no longer the vulnerable scapegoat they thought I was. I slowly picked up my glass of sparkling water, took a calm sip, and set it back down on the wobbly table. Then I reached into my designer purse and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope sealed with dark red wax. I placed it squarely on the table. My mother's eyes instantly locked onto it, lighting up with greedy anticipation. She knew I had a successful business, even if she constantly minimized it. In her mind, that thick envelope was my mandatory financial contribution to her grand illusion of wealth. You are absolutely right, I said smoothly, picking up my purse and standing up to my full height. I clearly do not belong at this table, and I certainly do not count as part of this family. I reached out and picked the heavy envelope right back up. So, I will just be taking my gift and heading home. Have a wonderful wedding, Chloe. I turned on my heel and began walking down the long hallway toward the grand exit. The heavy silence behind me lasted exactly 2 seconds before the sheer panic set in. Wait! Chloe screamed, her voice cracking completely, dropping her elegant bride persona. She lunged forward, her expensive white heels slipping wildly on the polished marble floor. She was terrified, and she had every right to be, because what she and her new mother-in-law did not know was that the envelope I was holding did not contain a generous check. It contained the complete financial ruin of the Sterling family, and I was about to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. Chloe's desperate scream echoed down the long, dimly lit corridor. Before I could take another step toward the grand exit, her manicured hands clamped around my wrist like a vice. Her perfectly polished acrylic nails dug sharply into my bare skin as she practically dragged me away from the catering staff and shoved me roughly into the secluded bridal suite. She slammed the heavy oak double doors shut behind us and planted her back against them. Her chest was heaving under her ridiculously expensive lace bodice, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, manic energy. You are not leaving, Nia, she snapped, her eyes darting immediately to the thick red wax-sealed envelope in my hand. Hand it over, right now. I know you brought a massive check and I need it. Before I could even ask my sister if she had completely lost her mind, the side door connecting to the private powder room burst open. Our mother, Vivian, marched in. Her face was contorted in a frantic mix of panic, fear, and raw anger. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not care that I had just been publicly humiliated by Beatrice Sterling right outside the kitchen doors. She did not care that I was treated like a second-class citizen at her youngest daughter's wedding. She went straight for the kill, just like she always did when it came to my money. Nia, you are the older sister, Vivian demanded, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. It is your duty to step up for your family. You need to pay the catering and floral bill right this second. It is $100,000. Give Chloe that envelope and hand over your corporate credit card right now before the event coordinator comes back. I stared at the two women who were supposed to be my family. The bridal suite around us was overflowing with imported white orchids and untouched bottles of vintage champagne. It was a suffocating display of wealth that neither of them actually possessed. They looked like strangers to me. They were entirely consumed by greed and the desperate need to maintain an illusion. Why exactly am I paying for a Sterling wedding? I asked, my voice dangerously calm and steady. I thought the Sterlings were old money royalty. I thought Julian's family practically owned this city. Chloe bit her bottom lip, looking away nervously, as her confident bride persona completely dissolved into cowardice. Vivian stepped closer, invading my personal space and lowering her voice into a harsh, aggressive whisper, as if the walls themselves were listening to our conversation. Julian's black card just had a minor technical glitch, she hissed aggressively. It declined. Twice. The vendors are threatening to pack up the crystal centerpieces and pull the filet mignon before the main reception even starts. You have money, Nia. I know how much that real estate company of yours makes. I read the articles about your recent acquisitions. You can afford this. Just do this for your sister. Do not ruin her perfect day with your typical stubbornness. I looked into my mother's desperate eyes and felt a lifetime of emotional exhaustion bubble up inside me. For 35 years, I had been the scapegoat, the workhorse, the daughter who was never pretty enough or compliant enough for her high society dreams. But I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply tightened my grip on the thick envelope in my hand, feeling the hard edges of the documents inside. A technical glitch, I repeated, letting a sharp, humorless laugh escape my throat. Is that what we are calling it now? A glitch. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing my mother to step back. I let my gaze travel slowly up and down the intricate beaded lace of Chloe's gown, taking in every expensive detail. Is it the same kind of technical glitch that happened 10 years ago, Mom? I asked, my tone dropping to a freezing whisper. You remember that, do you not? When my entire master's degree tuition fund mysteriously vanished from our joint bank account just weeks before my classes started. You stood right in front of me and told me it was a terrible bank error. You cried and said the money was gone. But you actually drained every single penny I had worked night shifts to save just to buy Chloe a brand new luxury car. You stole my future so she could keep up with her rich sorority sisters and pretend she was wealthy. Vivian flinched visibly, her eyes darting away toward the floor, but I stepped forward again, refusing to let her escape the truth of her own actions. And now here we are again, a decade later. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. Let me guess. You took out another secret high-interest loan just to buy her that $70,000 Vera Wang dress she is wearing right now. You mortgaged your own future and destroyed your credit to impress a family of white aristocrats who literally just seated your eldest daughter next to the garbage cans. You sold your pride for a seat at a table where they do not even want you. How dare you bring up the past? Vivian gasped, her hand flying to her chest in mock outrage as she tried to regain the upper hand. Chloe is marrying into the Sterling family today. This is our one chance to finally be part of real high society. We are securing a legacy. The Sterlings are powerful people, and you owe us this. You have always been so selfish with your wealth, Nia. You sit in your penthouse and judge us while we are trying to elevate the family name. Selfish, Chloe chimed in, her voice shrill and defensive. You are just jealous because I am the one getting the fairy tale while you are completely alone with your spreadsheets and your business meetings. Just give me the envelope, Nia. I know there is a massive check in there. You always try to buy our love anyway, just to prove you are better than us. She reached out blindly, trying to snatch the red wax-sealed envelope from my grip, but I pulled it back smoothly, holding it just out of her reach. I was not buying their love. I had stopped trying to purchase my mother's affection the day I moved out of her house with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart. Before I could tell my mother and sister exactly what they could do with their pathetic high society dreams, the heavy double doors of the bridal suite swung wide open. Julian stepped into the room, adjusting his diamond cufflinks with an air of absolute arrogant entitlement. Right behind him was Beatrice, his mother, her nose turned up as if the very air in our presence offended her delicate sensibilities. They walked in with a heavy, condescending attitude, completely ignoring the fact that Julian's own credit card had just bounced and nearly ruined his own wedding. They stood side by side, a united front of old money superiority, ready to command the room and put the troublesome black daughter back in her place. Beatrice Sterling closed the heavy oak door behind her, with a soft, definitive click that felt like a lock sealing a cage. She did not look at my mother, who immediately shrank back against the floral arrangements like a scolded servant. She did not look at Chloe, who was visibly trembling inside her $70,000 dress. Beatrice fixed her cold blue eyes entirely on me. She folded her arms across her champagne silk bodice, running her gaze over my skin with a look of absolute aristocratic disgust. I heard shouting. Beatrice said, her voice maintaining that terrifyingly calm, practiced tone of a woman used to ordering people around. We do not shout at Sterling Manor. In our circles, discretion is the absolute baseline of civilized behavior. I understand that where you come from, loud altercations might be the norm, but we expect better from our guests. She took a slow, measured step toward me. Her vintage pearls clicked softly against her collarbone. Let us be perfectly clear. Nia Beatrice continued, her lips curving into a thin, cruel smile. At our level of society, people like you should be falling to your knees in gratitude just to step foot onto this estate. We graciously allowed you to attend this wedding despite the obvious clash you present to our traditional aesthetic. We gave you a seat. We gave you a meal. Now your mother tells me you are causing a scene over a minor catering bill. Hand over the money right now. Pay the vendors what they are owed, and perhaps I will be generous enough to let you sit quietly in the hallway and enjoy the leftovers after the real family has eaten. I stared at this woman. She was standing in a manner that was crumbling under decades of hidden debt, wearing pearls she probably had to pawn and buy back twice, just to keep up appearances. Yet she was looking at me, a self-made millionaire, as if I were a peasant begging for scraps at her back door. Before I could even respond, Julian stepped up beside his mother. He shot his cuffs, adjusting the diamond links on his sleeves with a sickeningly arrogant smirk. He looked me up and down, shaking his head slightly as if I were a disappointing child. Look, Nia, let us just be real here, Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. My mother is being incredibly generous, even entertaining this conversation. Chloe mentioned you run some sort of small Black-owned business downtown. That is cute. It really is. I am sure you are very proud of your little hustle. But playing entrepreneur in some rented office space is very different from managing generational wealth. He chuckled, looking at Chloe, who nervously giggled in response, completely betraying me once again just to seek his approval. My black card just hit a temporary security freeze because of a massive international wire transfer. Julian lied smoothly without missing a single beat. It is a security protocol you would not understand because you do not operate at this financial tier. So here is the deal. You cover this minor $100,000 hiccup for the florist and the caterers today. In exchange, next week I will let you buy me a coffee. I will sit down with you for 15 minutes and give you some actual investment advice. I will show you how the big boys play the global market. Consider it an expensive but highly valuable masterclass in real finance. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of this man was almost breathtaking. He was broke. His family was financially drowning. His credit card had just declined for a wedding he was hosting on an estate that was bleeding money. And yet he stood there wrapped in unearned privilege, offering to teach me, the very woman who could buy and sell his entire bloodline before breakfast, how to manage money. Vivian stepped forward, clasping her hands together in a desperate pleading motion. Nia, please, Vivian begged, her voice shaking. Julian is offering you a huge favor. Listen to him. Do not be stubborn. Just give them the envelope and let us get back to the wedding. I looked at my mother. I looked at my sister, who was now standing firmly behind Julian, gripping his arm as if he were her savior. Then I looked at Beatrice and Julian, who were waiting with outstretched hands, fully expecting me to bow my head, open my purse, and fund their pathetic illusion of superiority. I did not yell. I did not scream. The anger that had been burning in my chest suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a cold, razor-sharp, absolute calm. Investment advice, I repeated softly, letting the words roll off my tongue. The room fell dead silent. And leftovers. I looked down at the thick, heavy envelope in my hands. The dark red wax seal gleamed under the crystal chandelier lighting of the bridal suite. Julian smirked, holding his hand out further, completely confident that I was about to hand over my hard-earned money to save his fraudulent pride. I did not hand it to him. Instead, I gripped the top edge of the envelope. I slid my manicured thumbnail right under the center of the dark red wax. The sharp, distinct snap of the wax breaking echoed loudly in the tense, silent room. Chloe gasped, taking a sudden step forward. Julian frowned, his outstretched hand dropping slightly as confusion briefly crossed his arrogant features. Beatrice narrowed her eyes, her posture stiffening as she sensed that something was entirely off script. You do not need to open it, Nia. Julian snapped, his voice losing its smooth, confident edge. Just hand the check directly to the event coordinator outside. I ignored him. I reached inside the torn envelope and pulled out the contents. It was not a check. It was not a corporate credit card. It was not a generous financial contribution to save the Sterling family wedding. I slowly unfolded the thick stack of papers. The stark white pages were bound together with heavy legal staples. But what made the breath completely leave Julian's lungs, and what caused Beatrice's face to drain of all its color, were the bold, unmistakable blood-red stamps pressed onto the top right corner of every single page. They were official seals from the County Superior Court. The heavy stack of documents slipped from my fingers and hit the glass surface of the bridal vanity with a loud, resounding smack. The impact knocked over a crystal champagne flute, sending expensive vintage liquor spilling across the polished wood and dripping onto the plush carpet, but nobody moved to clean it up. Every pair of eyes in the suite was absolutely glued to those stark red court seals. "I do not have $100,000 to fix your little technical glitch, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any anger. "But what I do have is a complete certified record of your actual net worth, or rather, your severe lack thereof." Julian lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure panic. He reached out to snatch the papers, but I swiftly placed my hand firmly over the stack, pinning it to the glass. "These are public record as of this morning, Julian," I stated, staring him down until he froze. "You can read them later. Let me give everyone else the summary right now." I turned my gaze to my mother and sister. Vivian was already trembling, her hands clasped tightly together as if bracing for a physical blow. Chloe simply stared at the papers, her mouth slightly open in confusion. "This first page is a detailed summary of Julian's outstanding markers at 3 different underground casinos in Macau and Las Vegas," I said, tapping the top sheet. "He owes over $4 million in illegal gambling debts. Debts to people who do not care about the Sterling family name and who do not politely ask for their money back." Chloe let out a sharp gasp, taking a sudden step away from Julian. Her eyes darted wildly between my face and his, hoping he would deny it. He did not. He just stood there, swallowing hard, a thin sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. I flipped to the second page, keeping my movements deliberate and unhurried. Page 2. Details. Multiple black market loans. I continued, my voice echoing loudly in the tense space. High-interest bridge loans taken out under shell companies just to keep this crumbling estate out of foreclosure for another 6 months. Sterling Manor is leveraged to the absolute hilt. The banks own the walls, the roof, and the very ground we are standing on. You are completely bankrupt, Julian. Your entire family is drowning in debt, and you are using my sister as a prop to secure a line of credit from our mother, who is foolish enough to mortgage her own future for you." "No," Vivian breathed out, shaking her head wildly. "No, Beatrice, you told me your family was secure. You told me the Sterlings were untouchable." Beatrice's face had drained of all its color, leaving her looking like a wax statue, but her eyes burned with a venomous, trapped fury. She opened her mouth to speak, but I completely cut her off. "And my absolute favorite part," I said, turning my full attention directly to my sister. "Hold up your left hand, Chloe. Show everyone the famous Sterling heirloom diamond, the one Beatrice bragged about during the rehearsal dinner, the one that has supposedly been in their family for 4 generations. Chloe instinctively brought her left hand up to her chest, her fingers curling protectively around the massive sparkling rock. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Julian pawned the real diamond 8 months ago to pay off a loan shark," I revealed, my words striking her like a physical blow. "The ring on your finger is high-grade cubic zirconia. It is an impressive fake, I will admit, but it is completely worthless, just like the man you are about to marry." The silence that followed was deafening. The illusion had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Chloe stared at her hand, her breath catching in her throat. She slowly turned her head toward Julian, her face crumpling into raw devastation. "Tell me, she is lying," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. "Tell me she made this up, Julian. Tell me my ring is real." Julian opened his mouth, his confident, arrogant persona completely stripped away, leaving only a cornered coward. Chloe, it is just a temporary cash flow issue, he stammered, taking a step toward her. I was going to get it back. The markets have just been volatile and I had to leverage some assets to protect the estate. You have to understand. Do not touch me! Chloe shrieked violently, pulling her arm out of his reach. She backed away until she hit the vanity, her chest heaving as the reality of her ruined fairy tale finally crashed down on her. You are broke. You are completely broke, and you let my mother drain her savings for this wedding. Vivian looked as if she might actually faint. She grabbed the edge of a chair for support, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. She had sold her soul, she had sold my future. She had bent over backward to please these people, all for absolute nothing. She had thrown me away to secure a seat at a table that was actively burning to the ground. Beatrice, however, was not going down without a fight. Cornered animals are always the most dangerous, and Beatrice Sterling had generations of entitlement fueling her rage. The waxen power of her face rapidly transformed into a deep, furious red. Her neck mottled with blotchy patches of pure indignation as she pointed a shaking, manicured finger right at my face. You lying, vindictive creature! Beatrice snarled, her voice dropping its refined tone and exposing the ugly venom underneath. How dare you bring these fabrications into my home? You fabricated these documents because you are jealous. You are a bitter, jealous outsider who could never belong in our world, so you are trying to destroy it. She stepped forward, completely abandoning her high society facade. The racism she had so carefully veiled in passive-aggressive compliments earlier now spilled out in raw, unfiltered hatred. You think because you wear an expensive dress and carry a designer bag that you are one of us? Beatrice spat, her eyes wide and unhinged. You are nothing. You are a small-minded nobody, with a fake little business trying to ruin a legacy you could never comprehend. I will not let a crazy black woman stand in my house and slander my family. She spun around, facing the heavy oak doors of the bridal suite, her voice rising to a shrill, desperate scream that echoed down the hallway. Guards! Beatrice shrieked frantically, waving her arms. Security! Get in here right now! I want this woman arrested for trespassing and corporate espionage. Guards! Get in here and throw this insane woman out of my house immediately! The heavy wooden doors burst open with a forceful bang. 4 massive security guards dressed in immaculate black suits and earpieces stepped into the room. Their expressions were completely stoic, their posture rigid and professional. They filled the entryway, blocking any chance of escape. Beatrice let out a triumphant, breathless laugh, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. Grab her! Beatrice ordered, her voice dripping with absolute malice. Seize her phone, grab those fake documents, and drag her off my property before I press charges. The 4 men stepped further into the room, their heavy boots completely silent on the plush carpet. Julian crossed his arms, regaining a fraction of his smug confidence, while Chloe and Vivian watched in terrified silence. But the guards did not move toward me. They walked straight past Beatrice. They walked straight past Julian, ignoring his outstretched hand. They moved with military precision, forming a perfect straight line directly behind my back. They folded their hands in front of them, turning their cold, unblinking gazes toward Beatrice and Julian. They stood there, completely still, awaiting my orders. The heavy silence in the bridal suite stretched into an agonizing eternity. The camera lens of reality seemed to pan slowly across the room, capturing every micro-expression of terror. It started with Beatrice, whose triumphant sneer froze, and then slowly melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as she stared at the wall of black-suited men standing firmly behind me. The invisible lens shifted to Julian, whose arms dropped limply to his sides, his smug confidence entirely evaporating. Finally, the focus settled squarely on my face. I allowed a slow, cold smirk to curve the edges of my lips. The lead security guard, a towering man named Marcus with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, stepped forward slightly. He completely ignored Beatrice and Julian. Instead, he dipped his head toward me in a sharp, respectful bow. Boss Marcus said, his deep voice rumbling through the quiet room. Do we need to clear this area? Are these individuals harassing you? Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp and half shriek. Her hands flew to her vintage pearls, clutching them as if she were trying to anchor herself to a reality that was rapidly slipping away. Why are you calling her boss? Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. What is wrong with you people? You work for me. You work for Sterling Manor. This is my house. I demand that you remove this woman right now. Marcus did not even blink. He did not turn to look at her. He simply kept his eyes fixed on me, waiting for my command. I raised my hand slightly, signaling for him to hold his position. I reached down to the glass vanity table where the stack of court documents still lay scattered. From the very bottom of the pile, I slid out a thick, crisp folder bound in dark leather. It did not have the red court seals like the debt records. It bore the gold-embossed logo of the State Land Registry. I picked it up and held it out, letting the heavy silence punish them for another few seconds. This is not your house, Beatrice, I stated, my voice echoing off the expensive floral arrangements. It has not been your house for a very long time. I opened the leather folder and pulled out the crisp deed of ownership, holding it up so the gold seal caught the light of the crystal chandelier. The Sterling family went completely bankrupt. Exactly 2 years and 4 months ago. I announced, projecting my voice so that every word struck like a hammer blow. The estate was leveraged against a series of terrible investments and offshore loans. When the market shifted, your accounts dried up. The bank foreclosed on this entire property 18 months ago. You have been fighting a losing legal battle to keep it a secret ever since. But you ran out of appeals last month. The bank put Sterling Manor up for a closed-door private auction. Beatrice began to shake uncontrollably. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to lose its bounce, and she suddenly looked like a very old, very tired woman trying to play dress-up in someone else's clothes. Julian backed away, bumping into the wall as if trying to merge with the wallpaper. And as luck would have it, I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the woman who had just insulted my race and my right to exist. My commercial real estate acquisitions firm, Apex Holdings, specializes in buying distressed historical properties. I purchased Sterling Manor in cash 30 days ago. I own the walls. I own the chandeliers. I own the driveway you parked your leased cars on. I even own the wobbly folding table you tried to stick me at near the kitchen doors. Chloe let out a whimpering sob, pressing both hands over her mouth. She looked around the bridal suite, as if the walls were closing in on her. The grand illusion of marrying into old money royalty was turning to dust right before her eyes. You do not live here anymore, Beatrice, I said, my tone dropping to a whisper that carried absolute authority. You are currently occupying my property under a special 36-hour short-term rental agreement. A lease that your son begged the bank to facilitate so he could pull off this fake wedding and trick my idiot sister into thinking she was marrying a billionaire. Your rental agreement expires exactly at midnight tonight. After that, my security team will escort you off the premises. The absolute devastation in the room was palpable. Beatrice opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Julian, begging him silently to deny it, to pull some brilliant legal maneuver out of his pocket and save their aristocratic pride. But Julian was staring at the floor, completely broken. The arrogant prince of Sterling Manor was nothing more than a fraud facing his landlord. Chloe turned on Julian, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure betrayal. You lied to me, Chloe shrieked, hitting his chest with her fists. You told me we were moving into the East Wing after the honeymoon. You told me this was our family estate. You are a broke, pathetic liar. Julian caught her wrist, pushing her away roughly. Oh, grow up, Chloe. He snapped, his own facade finally shattering. You were just as happy to use my last name to impress your little country club friends. Do not act like you loved me for anything other than the zip code. We both needed this wedding. You needed the status, and I needed your mother's money to pay off the caterers so we could collect the cash gifts from the guests. The ugly truth was finally laid bare. It was a transaction. A desperate fake merger between a broke aristocrat and a desperate social climbing family, and I was the only one holding all the cards. I turned to look at my mother, expecting her to finally see the light, expecting her to realize that she had drained her entire life savings and stolen my future just to buy her favorite daughter a ticket on a sinking ship. But Vivian was not looking at the deed. She was not looking at the security guards. She was staring at Julian with a wild, manic gleam in her eyes. The depth of her delusion was truly terrifying to witness. She simply could not accept that her grand societal triumph was a complete lie. "No!" Vivian gasped, stepping forward and placing her body between Chloe and Julian as if physically shielding the illusion. "No, this is just a minor setback. Real estate is complicated. Things get restructured all the time." She turned to me, her face contorted with a desperate, aggressive denial. "You think you are so smart?" Nia Vivian yelled, pointing her finger at me again. "You think buying this old house makes you better than them? But Julian is a genius. He is a tech visionary." Vivian grabbed Julian's arm, shaking it excitedly as she turned to Chloe. "Do not listen to her!" "Chloe." Vivian pleaded, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "Julian just told me yesterday that he successfully raised $20 million in seed funding for his new tech startup. $20 million. He has investors lined up around the block. He is going to be the next Silicon Valley billionaire. As soon as the funds clear next week, he will just buy this stupid house right back from your sister. We do not need her money. We do not need her at all. He is going to save everything." Vivian clung to Julian's arm, looking at him with absolute reverence, waiting for him to validate her desperate fantasy. But Julian was not looking at Vivian. He was staring directly at me, his face draining of whatever color it had left, as his eyes locked onto the final piece of paper sitting on the vanity table. I picked up that final sheet of paper, holding it loosely between my fingers. The space between us seemed to expand as I stepped back, allowing the absolute reality of their situation to settle over the room. I stood in the center of the bridal suite, entirely in control, while my mother, my sister Beatrice, and Julian unconsciously backed away until they were practically pressed against the flocked silk wallpaper. They looked like four-cornered animals, completely stripped of their delusions of grandeur. A sharp, genuinely amused laugh escaped my throat. It was not a bitter sound, but a sound of pure, unadulterated victory. $20 million, I repeated, letting the astronomical number hang in the heavy air. $20 million in seed funding for a revolutionary new tech startup. That is a very impressive figure, Julian. It truly is. Vivian nodded frantically, her eyes darting between Julian and me. "Yes," she insisted, her voice shrill with desperate hope. "He is brilliant, Nia. You just do not understand the tech industry. He is backed by Vanguard Investment Fund. They are the biggest venture capital firm in the state. He is going to be richer than you could ever dream of being." I ignored my mother, keeping my eyes locked on Julian. His breathing had become shallow and rapid. The sweat on his forehead was now dripping down the side of his face, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He knew exactly what paper I was holding. "Tell me, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a conversational yet freezing tone. "When you pitched your little startup to Vanguard, did you ever bother to read the names on their board of directors? Did you ever do basic due diligence on the people you were begging for money?" Julian opened his mouth, but his jaw simply worked up and down without producing a single sound. He looked as though the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath him. Chloe grabbed his arm, shaking him. "Julian, what is she talking about?" Chloe demanded, her voice cracking with fresh panic. "Tell her to shut up. Tell her your funding is secure." "He cannot do that, Chloe," I stated smoothly, stepping closer and forcing Julian to look directly into my eyes. "Because Vanguard Investment Fund is a subsidiary of Apex Holdings, my company. I am the founder, the chairwoman, and the majority shareholder of the exact fund Julian just tried to scam out of $20 million. Vivian let out a choked gasp, stumbling backward and gripping the edge of the velvet sofa to keep from collapsing. Beatrice pressed her hands against her ears as if physically trying to block out the words that were destroying her son's future. "My audit team is incredibly thorough, Julian." I continued, my tone shifting from conversational to ruthlessly professional. "When your application crossed my desk 3 weeks ago, I decided to let it play out. I wanted to see exactly how bold you really were. My team dug into your revolutionary code. We dug into your user metrics. We audited your projected revenue streams. Do you want to tell your mother and your blushing bride what my analysts actually found? Julian violently shook his head, backing away until his shoulders hit the heavy oak door. His eyes were wide with pure animalistic terror. Please, Nia, he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. Please do not do this. I can fix the code. I just needed the capital to hire better developers. I can make the platform work. You built a shell, Julian, I stated, cutting off his pathetic bargaining. You hired cheap overseas developers to build a wireframe that does absolutely nothing. You created thousands of fake user accounts using bot farms to inflate your engagement metrics. You falsified banking records to show artificial revenue streams. You did not build a tech startup. You built a highly sophisticated criminal fraud. Beatrice let out a guttural cry, lunging forward and placing herself between me and Julian. She was shaking with a mixture of terror and aristocratic rage. You cannot prove any of that, she shrieked wildly. You are making this up to ruin us. You are a vindictive liar and nobody will believe a word you say. I smiled warmly at Beatrice, holding up the final document. This is a signed affidavit from my lead forensic auditor, I explained, taking a slow step toward the disgraced matriarch. It details every single fake account, every forged bank statement, and every illegal wire transfer Julian executed to make his company look legitimate. And right beneath it is a copy of the stop order I issued exactly 1 hour ago. I turned my gaze back to Julian, watching the final light of hope completely extinguish in his eyes. Your $20 million disbursement has been permanently frozen, Julian. I said, my words striking like nails into a coffin. The funds will never clear. You are not buying back this estate. You are not paying off your illegal gambling debts. You are not saving your family legacy. You are exactly what I said you were. A broke, pathetic fraud playing dress-up with other people's money. Chloe let out a devastating wail. She looked down at her hand, staring at the fake cubic zirconia ring that she had been flashing to her friends for the past year. With a violent, jerky motion, she ripped the ring off her finger and threw it directly at Julian's chest. It bounced off his expensive tuxedo jacket and hit the floor, rolling away into the corner of the room. I hate you! Chloe screamed, her face blotchy and stained with ruined makeup. You ruined my life. You promised me a fairy tale, and you are nothing but a criminal. She turned to Vivian, grabbing our mother by the shoulders. Mom, do something, Chloe begged hysterically. Fix this! Make him fix this! But Vivian was completely paralyzed. The woman who had spent her entire life chasing status, chasing the approval of wealthy white aristocrats, chasing a dream that never existed, was finally forced to look at reality. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. She had sacrificed her eldest daughter, the only person who had actually achieved real wealth and stability, to worship a family of con artists. Nia, Vivian whispered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. Nia, please. You have the money. You own the fund. You own this house. Please, you have to help your sister. She is wearing her wedding dress. The guests are waiting downstairs. You cannot let her be humiliated like this. Just release the funds. Just let the wedding happen and we can figure everything out tomorrow. I stared at my mother, feeling a profound sense of closure. For 35 years, her conditional love had been the heavy anchor dragging me down. I had spent my youth desperate for her validation, trying to prove that my intelligence, my hard work, my quiet determination were just as valuable as Chloe's superficial charm. I had finally realized that Vivian's approval was not a prize worth winning. It was a disease, and I was finally cured. There is no wedding, Mom, I said, my voice perfectly calm, completely devoid of the hurt that used to live in my chest. The caterers are packing up the food right now. The florists are loading their vans. I told the event coordinator the truth 10 minutes ago. The Sterling family cannot pay their bills. The party is over. Beatrice let out a long, defeated moan, sinking slowly into one of the velvet chairs. She covered her face with her hands, her pristine manicured nails digging into her forehead. She was a queen without a kingdom, a woman whose entire identity was tied to a manor she no longer owned and wealth she no longer possessed. As for your startup, Julian, I continued ignoring Beatrice's breakdown and focusing entirely on the man who had tried to humiliate me. Falsifying financial records to secure venture capital is a federal crime. It is called wire fraud. And because you used interstate banking systems to inflate your numbers, the jurisdiction falls entirely out of local hands. My legal team submitted our audit findings to the authorities early this morning. Julian fell to his knees. The sharp crease of his tuxedo trousers splashed into the spilled champagne, but he did not care. He pressed his hands against the floor, looking up at me with absolute begging desperation. "I will do anything," Julian pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "I will sign whatever you want. I will publicly apologize. Please, Nia, do not send me to prison. I am a sterling. I cannot survive in a place like that." "You stopped being a sterling the day the bank took your house," I replied, my voice completely devoid of pity. "Now you are just another white-collar criminal." Before Julian could utter another pathetic plea, a sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the bridal suite. It was faint at first, drifting through the thick glass of the high-arched windows. But within seconds, it grew louder, more urgent, and absolutely unmistakable. It was the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens. The sound echoed across the manicured lawns, bouncing off the stone walls of the estate. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect against the windows, casting harsh, frantic shadows across the faces of my mother, my sister Beatrice, and Julian. The authorities were coming up the main driveway of Sterling Manor. The wail of the sirens cut abruptly as the squad cars braked hard on the gravel outside. Heavy footsteps echoed rapidly down the grand hallway, creating a sharp, jarring contrast to the delicate classical music that had been playing just moments before. Marcus and my security team smoothly parted like the Red Sea, allowing 2 uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective to step directly into the bridal suite. Julian scrambled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the champagne-soaked carpet until he was practically hyperventilating against the vanity mirror. He looked like a trapped rat. The detective did not waste time with pleasantries or formal introductions. He held up a folded piece of paper, his voice carrying the bored absolute authority of the law. "Julian Sterling, we have a federal warrant for your arrest on multiple charges of wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement," the detective announced, stepping forward with a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Julian let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. The uniformed officers moved in swiftly, grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back. The metallic click of the cuffs snapping shut sounded louder than a gunshot in the confined space. Chloe completely lost her mind. The reality that she was not becoming a billionaire's wife but rather the punchline of a highly publicized criminal scandal broke her fragile psyche in an instant. She dropped to her knees, screaming hysterically, her hands clawed blindly at her $70,000 Vera Wang gown. The delicate imported lace ripped under her manicured nails, tearing the ridiculously expensive fabric into jagged, useless strips. She thrashed against the floor, sobbing so violently that she could barely breathe, mourning the immediate death of her unearned status. Beatrice watched her son being manhandled by the police, and her aristocratic composure shattered into a million jagged pieces. But she did not attack the officers. She did not yell at Julian for ruining their family name. Instead, she spun around and locked her furious, unhinged gaze entirely on Vivian and Chloe. The mask of polite high society fully dissolved, revealing the ugly, rotting core of who she truly was. Beatrice unleashed a torrent of venom so vile it seemed to poison the very air in the room. "This is all your fault," Beatrice shrieked, spit flying from her lips as she pointed a shaking finger at my mother. "You filthy gold-digging parasites! We were perfectly fine before you forced your way into our lives. You brought this ghetto curse into my home. I knew we never should have associated with your kind." Beatrice took a menacing step toward Vivian, her face contorted with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You desperate colored trash!" Beatrice spat the racial slurs flowing effortlessly from her aristocratic mouth. "You thought you could buy your way into white society. You thought your cheap, uncultured daughter was worthy of the Sterling name. You ruined my son. You brought nothing but bad luck and ghetto filth to my family." Vivian froze, her eyes widening, as the horrific insult slapped her across the face. For her entire life, my mother had worshipped women exactly like Beatrice. She had abandoned her own culture, rejected her own community, and sacrificed my entire future just to be accepted by this exact demographic. And now the grand illusion was dead. She was not an equal. To Beatrice, she was nothing more than an interloper, a racial stereotype, a scapegoat to blame for their own criminal failures. Something dark and primitive finally snapped behind Vivian's eyes. With a guttural scream of pure rage, Vivian lunged forward. She swung her hand with all her might. The slap echoed through the room like a firecracker. Beatrice's head snapped violently to the side, her vintage pearl necklace breaking from the impact. The heavy pearls scattered across the hardwood floor like tiny white bullets. Beatrice let out a feral shriek and lunged right back. The two women crashed into the massive floral arrangements. The crystal vases shattered, sending water-white orchids and broken glass flying everywhere. It was an incredibly ugly, violent brawl. Vivian grabbed a fistful of Beatrice's perfectly styled blonde hair, yanking her head downward with vicious force. Beatrice clawed wildly at Vivian's expensive silk dress, tearing the fabric and leaving deep, bloody scratches across my mother's chest. They rolled onto the champagne-soaked carpet, punching, biting, and screaming pure obscenities at each other. They looked like wild animals, fighting over garbage, completely destroying the high society image they had both sold their souls to maintain. I stood perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction unfold around me. I let my gaze slowly travel in a complete sweeping circle around the ruined bridal suite, taking in every detail of their downfall. To my left, Julian was sobbing uncontrollably as the police dragged him out the door by his collar, his pathetic cries echoing down the long hallway as he begged them not to ruin his suit. To my right, Chloe was curled into a tight fetal position in the corner, rocking back and forth in her shredded, mud-stained wedding dress, hyperventilating through her tears. And right at my feet, the two matriarchs were tearing each other apart in the dirt, and the broken glass fighting a useless war over a kingdom that did not even exist anymore. It was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Marcus and his men finally stepped in, prying the two violently thrashing women apart. They dragged Beatrice to the far side of the room, holding her back as she kicked and screamed like a banshee. They left Vivian panting and bleeding on the floor. Her dress was ruined, her hair was a tangled mess, and her face was heavily bruised. Vivian looked up, her wild eyes darting around the ruined room before finally locking onto me. The fog of violence cleared from her gaze and was instantly replaced by a terrifying manic delusion. She refused to accept that the game was over. Vivian scrambled across the floor, her hands slipping on the wet carpet and the crushed flowers. She crawled directly to my feet and threw her arms around my ankles, gripping me with a bruising, desperate strength. Nia Vivian gasped, her voice hoarse and frantic as she stared up at me with pleading, desperate eyes. Nia, you have the money. I know you have it. You own that company. You own this house. Please, you have to help us. You have to save your sister's special day. Pay Julian's bail right now. Give the police whatever they want to let him go. We can still fix this and save the wedding. I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me. My shadow fell heavily across her bruised and tear-stained face. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers out in the driveway painted her desperate features in alternating strokes of harsh crimson and cold blue. Her manicured fingers were digging into my skin, leaving crescent-shaped indentations through my sheer stockings. Vivian was still begging, still demanding that I open my checkbook to rescue a criminal simply because he possessed a last name she coveted. She was entirely trapped in a delusion of high society that had just violently shattered around her. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I did not feel a spark of daughterly obligation. The vast reservoir of forgiveness I had kept designated for her for my entire life had permanently dried up. With a swift, deliberate motion, I pulled my leg back. I jerked my ankle out of her frantic grip with enough force that Vivian lost her balance and slumped forward onto the damp champagne-soaked carpet. She gasped, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes, as if I had just struck her physically. "Get up, Vivian! I commanded, my voice dropping to a freezing, unyielding pitch. Have some dignity. You are ruining my floor. Vivian scrambled to her knees, but she did not stand. She remained on the ground staring at me with a mixture of horror and utter confusion. Nia, please, she whispered, her voice cracking into a pathetic rasp. You are family. You have to do this for us. You have the power to fix everything. Family, I repeated, testing the word as if it were a completely foreign concept. That is a fascinating word for you to use today. I took a slow, calculated step forward, forcing her to tilt her head further back to maintain eye contact. I wanted her to see the absolute void of emotion in my gaze. I wanted her to realize that the daughter she had treated like a stepping stone was now a mountain she could never conquer. Do you remember when I was 23 years old, I asked, my words slicing cleanly through the heavy air of the ruined bridal suite. I was working 3 different jobs just to pay my tuition and keep a roof over my head. I was sleeping 3 hours a night trying to build a future out of nothing. I collapsed at the diner during my evening shift. They rushed me to the emergency room with severe exhaustion and a dangerously high fever. Vivian blinked repeatedly, her eyes darting nervously toward Chloe, who was still curled in the corner, shivering in her shredded wedding gown. Vivian swallowed hard but could not formulate a response. She knew exactly what day I was talking about. I was lying in a sterile hospital bed attached to an IV drip, shivering so violently that my teeth were chipping. I continued painting the memory with surgical precision. The billing department needed a guarantor because I had no health insurance, and my bank account was entirely empty. I called you 6 times. You sent my calls straight to voicemail. So I sent you a text message begging you to come down to the hospital and sign the paperwork so they would not discharge me out into the street while I was still violently ill. Vivian pressed her trembling hands against the floor. I was busy, she stammered defensively, automatically falling back into her old lifelong habits of justification. I had things to do, Nia. I could not just drop everything. Yes, you could, I replied, my tone dangerously quiet. You texted me back exactly 15 minutes later. I still have the screenshot saved on a hard drive to this very day. I am busy taking Chloe to get her nails done for the country club gala. You are an adult. Figure it out yourself. You are nothing but a throwaway child who only ever brings me stress. I recited the message word for word, letting the suffocating silence of the room press down on her shoulders. You told me I was a throwaway, Vivian, I said, lowering my voice to a sharp, penetrating whisper. You left me to freeze in a hospital waiting room so your favorite daughter could get a French manicure. And now you are kneeling in the dirt and the broken glass, begging at the feet of that very same throwaway. Vivian opened her mouth, but the words died in her throat. The realization finally struck her with the force of a freight train. The absolute finality of my statement breached the thick walls of her lifelong delusion. I was not going to save her. I was not going to save Chloe. I was going to stand by and watch them drown in the spectacular mess they had created for themselves. The social ladder she had spent decades trying to climb had just been kicked away by the daughter she had consistently stepped on. Nia, please. Vivian wept, covering her face with her hands. I am your mother. You were my mother, I corrected her smoothly, stepping away from her crumpled form. Today, you are just a trespasser. I turned away from my family completely, severing the remaining emotional tether between us. I looked at Marcus, who was standing rigidly by the heavy oak doors. His face was a mask of professional stoicism, but his sharp eyes were locked onto mine, waiting for my command. He had watched the entire exchange without moving a muscle. Marcus, I said, my voice carrying absolute unbroken authority. Yes, boss, he responded immediately, standing perfectly straight. The short-term rental agreement for this property has officially been violated. I instructed loud enough for everyone in the room to hear clearly. The tenants have engaged in fraudulent criminal activity on my premises. The lease is terminated effective immediately. I gestured toward the hallway leading out to the rest of the manor. Cancel the party, I ordered. Shut down the catering. Cut the music. Throw every single guest off my land. Understood, Boss Marcus replied without a trace of hesitation. He raised his shoulder radio to his mouth, pressing the transmit button. All units, this is actual. The event is cancelled. The lease is terminated. Initiate a full perimeter sweep and clear the grand ballroom. Escort all unauthorized individuals off the property immediately. Involve local authorities for trespassing if anyone refuses to comply. The radio crackled loudly with a chorus of affirmative responses from the dozens of heavily armed security guards stationed throughout the manor grounds. The machine was now in motion and absolutely nothing could stop it. The operation shifted from a private family dispute to a massive logistical eviction. I walked past Vivian, leaving her sobbing on the damp carpet. I stepped past Chloe, who was hyperventilating into the torn shreds of her Vera Wang dress, completely paralyzed by the reality of her shattered fairy tale. I walked out of the bridal suite, leaving the wreckage of their ambitions behind me. I stepped out into the grand hallway, the thick carpets muffling my footsteps, as I made my way toward the sweeping marble balcony that overlooked the massive ballroom below. The air out here was cool and smelled of fresh white orchids and expensive catering. Downstairs, the scene was a picture of breathtaking, aristocratic perfection. Hundreds of guests dressed in haute couture gowns and custom-tailored tuxedos were sipping expensive vintage champagne and laughing softly under the warm, brilliant glow of my crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white uniforms circulated effortlessly with silver trays of imported caviar and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A 12-piece string orchestra was playing a sweeping classical waltz on the raised stage in the corner. They were completely oblivious to the police cars flashing outside. They were completely oblivious to the absolute destruction of the Sterling family occurring just one floor above them. They believed they were attending the social event of the decade hosted by a family of untouchable billionaires. I rested my hands on the cool marble railing, looking down at the sea of wealthy, ignorant elites. I watched as my black-suited security team began to file into the room through the side doors, moving with silent, tactical precision. They were fanning out, taking positions at every exit, and slowly making their way toward the orchestra stage. I leaned forward, a slow, cold smile curving my lips as I anticipated the glorious, unprecedented chaos that was about to unfold. The music was about to stop. The champagne was about to be confiscated. How would these hundreds of arrogant, untouchable elites react when they were told they were trespassing on my property and thrown out into the street like common criminals? Marcus and his team moved with the synchronized precision of a military strike. They fanned out across the grand ballroom, blocking the heavy mahogany exit doors, while 2 guards flanked the orchestra stage. The sudden presence of heavily armed men in black tactical suits, cutting through the sea of pastel chiffon and bespoke tuxedos, caused an immediate ripple of confusion. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped entirely. Marcus stepped onto the raised stage and placed a heavy hand on the conductor's shoulder. The music died instantly, with a sharp, jarring screech from a cello string. The sudden silence in the cavernous room was deafening. Marcus picked up the microphone intended for the best man's toast. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his deep voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "By order of the property owner, this event has been terminated. Please gather your belongings and proceed calmly to the nearest exit. Your valet drivers are being notified to bring your vehicles around." A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. 300 of the state's wealthiest and most influential citizens stared at the stage in absolute bewilderment. Whispers erupted like dry brush catching fire. Mayors, tech CEOs, and real estate moguls exchanged insulted, outraged glances. "Wait, stop this immediately." Beatrice pushed her way through the double doors at the back of the room. She had clearly tried to fix her appearance, wiping the smeared mascara from her cheeks and smoothing down her torn silk dress. But she still looked like a woman who had just survived a shipwreck. She marched toward the center of the ballroom, wearing a brittle, frantic smile, attempting to salvage the unsalvageable. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding," Beatrice declared, projecting her voice to reach the back of the room. "Please, everyone, do not panic. It is just a minor plumbing issue in the East Wing. A burst pipe, nothing more. The security team is just taking precautions. We will have the music back on and the champagne flowing in just a few minutes." She looked around desperately, nodding at a state senator and forcing a laugh. You know how these historical estates are, always a little temperamental. I stepped out from the shadows of the mezzanine and began my descent down the grand sweeping marble staircase. The heels of my shoes clicked rhythmically against the stone, cutting through Beatrice's pathetic lies. The crowd parted naturally as I reached the ground floor, giving me a wide berth. I walked directly to the stage and Marcus handed me the microphone without a word. "There is no burst pipe," I said, my voice echoing clearly off the vaulted ceilings. "I apologize for the abrupt end to your evening. However, the Sterling family does not own this estate. I do. Their short-term rental agreement expired due to a severe breach of contract. They are entirely bankrupt, and you are currently standing on my private property." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Beatrice stood frozen in the center of the room, the color draining from her face until she looked like a ghost. Furthermore, I continued, my gaze sweeping over the sea of shocked faces. "The groom, Julian Sterling, will not be joining you. He was just escorted out the back entrance by federal authorities on charges of massive wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. I suggest you all leave before the press arrives to photograph who was attending a criminal's fake wedding. Please drive safely." The ballroom erupted. The fragile illusion of high society decorum evaporated in an instant. The whispers turned into loud, indignant demands. Wealthy socialites grabbed their designer coats and practically sprinted toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the Sterling name before the scandal could stain their own reputations. Beatrice tried to grab the arm of a prominent judge, begging him to listen, but he pulled away with a look of utter disgust and hurried out the door. The ultimate social death of Beatrice Sterling was happening in real time, and it was entirely her own doing. "You ruined it!" The hysterical scream tore through the chaos, echoing from the top of the grand staircase. Chloe stood on the landing, clutching the banister. Her $70,000 Vera Wang gown was ripped and stained. Her veil hung sideways from her tangled hair. Her face was a twisted, distorted mask of pure jealousy and absolute despair. She pointed a shaking finger down at me, her voice cracking as she sobbed. "You planned this!" Chloe shrieked, descending the stairs with reckless, frantic steps. "You set us up. You are so jealous of me, Nia. You have always been jealous of me. You used your dirty money to ruin my happiness because no man would ever want you. You destroyed my perfect day." The few remaining guests paused near the doors, turning to watch the bride's spectacular meltdown. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysteria. I simply handed the microphone back to Marcus and walked to the base of the stairs, waiting for her to reach the bottom. "Happiness?" I asked smoothly, cutting off her frantic rambling. I looked deeply into her tear-streaked eyes. "Is that what you call this, Chloe? Happiness with a man who is currently sitting in the back of a federal squad car? Happiness with a mother-in-law who despises your skin color and openly calls you ghetto trash the second you are out of earshot?" Chloe flinched physically, stepping back as the words struck her. "You spent your entire life stepping on me to prove you were the better daughter." I continued, my tone devoid of any sympathy. "You drained our mother's life savings to buy a ticket into a world that never actually wanted you. You played the golden child perfectly. But look at yourself now. In the end, you are nothing more than a cheap ornament attached to a completely bankrupt family." Chloe's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute devastating truth of my words stripped away the very last layers of her denial. Her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, burying her face in her hands and sobbing with a loud, broken wail that echoed through the empty ballroom. The remaining guests shook their heads in pure disgust, muttering under their breath as they hurried out the heavy oak doors, leaving the ruined bride weeping alone on the marble steps. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I turned my back on my sister and walked straight out the front doors of the manor. The cool night air hit my face, carrying the sharp scent of pine and impending rain. The sprawling gravel parking lot was a chaotic mess of luxury vehicles trying to escape the property at once. Valet drivers were sprinting back and forth while angry guests honked their horns. I ignored the commotion entirely, walking toward the designated staff parking area, where my quiet, understated sedan was waiting in the shadows. The job was done. The poison had been excised. I was finally completely free. I unlocked my car door, reaching for the handle. Nia, wait. I froze. The voice came from the shadows between two massive oak trees near the edge of the lot. Vivian stepped out into the dim light of a security lamp. Her dress was still torn from her brawl with Beatrice. She looked incredibly small standing there in the cold, her arms wrapped around herself as she blocked my path to the driver's side door. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked at the woman who had spent her entire adult life treating me as a defective accessory. The damp night air hung heavily between us, amplifying the sound of the distant police sirens still wailing at the front gates of the estate. Vivian shivered, the torn silk of her ruined dress fluttering in the harsh wind. The pristine high society facade she had painstakingly maintained for decades was completely gone. Her expensive makeup was smeared across her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks, mingling with fresh tears. But these were not tears of genuine remorse or realization. I knew my mother better than anyone. I recognized the precise moment she shifted her strategy. When aggression and authority failed, she always defaulted to the ultimate weapon of the emotional manipulator. She was going to play the victim. Nia, my sweet girl. Vivian choked out, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. She took a step toward me, her hands reaching out as if to embrace me. Please do not walk away from me. You cannot leave your family like this. We are all we have left. I stood perfectly still, letting her hands hover in the empty space between us, until she finally let them drop awkwardly to her sides. Do not do that, Vivian, I said, my voice flat and devoid of any warmth. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending to be a mother now. The performance is over. The audience is gone. Vivian let out a dramatic broken sob, pressing her hands against her chest. How can you be so cold to me? She wept, the tears flowing freely now. After everything I have sacrificed for you, after everything I have done to make sure you would succeed in this world. I tilted my head, studying her with clinical detachment. Sacrificed for me, I repeated, testing the absolute absurdity of the phrase. You threw me out of the house when I was 18 years old with absolutely nothing. You refused to co-sign my student loans. You mocked my business degree. You told your country club friends that I was a failure who was dead to you, so you would not have to explain why I was working in a diner instead of marrying a trust fund heir. Vivian shook her head vigorously, wiping her eyes with the back of her bruised hand. You do not understand, Nia. You have never understood. I had to do those things. I had to be hard on you. She took another desperate step forward, her eyes wide and pleading, trying to sell the ultimate lie. I knew you were strong, Vivian insisted, her voice rising with desperate conviction. I knew you had a fire inside of you that Chloe never had. If I had coddled you, if I had handed everything to you on a silver platter, you would have ended up soft and dependent. I had to push you away so you would learn to stand on your own 2 feet. I had to be the villain so you could become the hero. She gestured wildly toward the massive stone manor behind us. And look at you now, Vivian cried, a twisted smile of triumph breaking through her tears. Look at what you have built. You own this entire estate. You are a billionaire. You are the most powerful woman in this city. Do you not see it, Nia? My methods worked. My tough love made you into this incredible, successful woman. You are everything I designed you to be. I stared at her, feeling a profound, chilling wave of absolute disgust wash through my veins. For years I had wondered how she justified her cruelty. I had spent countless nights in my tiny college apartment crying myself to sleep, wondering what was so fundamentally broken inside of me that my own mother could not love me. Now hearing her attempt to rebrand decades of emotional abuse and blatant neglect as some sort of masterful parenting strategy, the last lingering ghost of my childhood trauma simply evaporated. There was no anger left in me. There was no sadness. There was only a cold, sterile pity for the pathetic, delusional woman standing in the dirt. You really believe that, do you not? I asked, my voice dropping to a terrifying quiet register. You have actually convinced yourself that your cruelty was an act of maternal sacrifice. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to back up against the side of the parked sedan. "Let us be entirely clear, Vivian," I said, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. "I did not succeed because of your tough love. I succeeded in spite of your absolute failure as a mother. I built my empire using the bricks you threw at me. Every dollar I made, every property I acquired, every ounce of power I now hold was forged in the fire of my own survival. You do not get to claim credit for the masterpiece simply because you provided the trauma that inspired it." Vivian gasped, her back pressed flat against the cold metal of the car door. Her lower lip trembled violently, but I did not give her a single second to interrupt. "You did not push me away to make me strong." I continued, leaning in slightly so she could not escape my gaze. "You discarded me because I was an inconvenience to your social climbing. I was not pretty enough, I was not compliant enough, and I refused to play the role of a silent, decorative accessory. You wanted a daughter you could sell to the highest bidder to secure your own comfortable retirement." I gestured back toward the brightly lit manor, where police officers were currently leading guests out the front doors. "So you placed your bets on Chloe," I said coldly. "You invested every ounce of your time, every single dollar of your savings, and every shred of your maternal affection into her superficiality. You groomed her to be a parasite. You taught her that her only value was in her physical appearance and her ability to manipulate wealthy men. You fed her ego until she became a monster entirely incapable of surviving in the real world." "Nia, please stop!" Vivian whimpered, shaking her head side to side. "We are ruined. We have absolutely nothing left. Julian took the house. He took the accounts. If you do not help us, we will be out on the street by tomorrow morning. You have to take care of us. You are the only one who can." I stepped back, creating a physical distance to match the vast emotional chasm between us. "I do not have to do anything," I stated with absolute finality. "You made your investment, Vivian. You chose to nurture Chloe's vanity while trying to starve my ambition. The market has simply corrected itself. You bet your entire future on a fraudulent criminal and a hollow daughter. Now it is time to collect your returns. Let Chloe's vanity put a roof over your head. Let her designer dresses feed you." I turned away from her, reaching into my pocket and pulling out my phone. I pressed a single button signaling Marcus. I had no intention of driving myself home in a discreet sedan tonight. The era of me hiding in the shadows to protect their fragile egos was officially over. Vivian panicked, lunging forward and grabbing the sleeve of my coat. "You cannot do this!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a raw, hysterical shriek. "I gave birth to you. You owe me your life. You owe me everything you have. You are a cold, heartless monster, Nia." I calmly peeled her fingers off my coat, stepping out of her reach. "No, Vivian." I corrected her smoothly, smoothing down my sleeve. "I am simply the daughter you raised. I am matching your exact energy. I am giving you the exact same grace and support you gave me when I was lying in a hospital bed begging for my mother. I am giving you absolutely nothing." A pair of blinding headlights suddenly swept across the gravel parking lot, cutting through the darkness. The low, powerful purr of a massive engine echoed off the surrounding trees. A custom midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided silently into the staff parking area, pulling up smoothly right beside where we stood. Vivian froze, her mouth hanging open, as she stared at the gleaming luxury vehicle. The sheer display of wealth and absolute power rendered her completely speechless. The driver, a tall man in an immaculate dark suit, immediately stepped out and walked around to open the heavy rear door for me. He stood at attention, waiting respectfully. I looked at Vivian one last time. She looked broken, terrified, and utterly defeated. The grand illusion of her life had burned to the ground, and she was finally staring at the ashes. "Enjoy the walk home, Vivian," I said without a single trace of emotion. I stepped into the spacious leather interior of the Rolls-Royce, and the driver shut the door behind me with a solid, definitive thud. The thick, soundproof glass completely muted the outside world. I settled into the plush seat, watching through the tinted window as the driver got back behind the wheel and put the car in gear. As the massive vehicle began to pull away, I could see Vivian standing alone in the cold gravel lot. Her face was contorted in a silent scream of absolute despair. She fell to her knees, her hands reaching out toward the departing taillights, mourning the loss of the wealth and status she had just watched drive permanently out of her life. I did not look back again. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the chilled console, took a slow, deep breath, and instructed the driver to take me home. The war was officially over. I had finally won. The blurred reflection of the streetlights sliding across the tinted glass of the Rolls-Royce slowly morphed. The rhythmic hum of the powerful engine faded away entirely, replaced by the absolute profound silence of a high-rise in the sky. I blinked, watching the morning rain streak down the floor-to-ceiling glass of my penthouse, overlooking the sprawling city skyline. The chaotic, violent spectacle in the estate parking lot was now safely locked away in the past. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting the warmth settle into my chest as I looked out over the empire I had conquered. News of the Sterling family's spectacular implosion dominated the national headlines for months. It was a relentless media circus that fed the public's insatiable appetite for the destruction of the corrupt elite. Julian Sterling, the so-called untouchable prince of industry, traded his bespoke Italian tuxedos and imported silk ties for a standard-issue, rough cotton orange jumpsuit. The federal judge presiding over his case showed absolutely no leniency for his massive wire fraud and corporate embezzlement schemes. The trial exposed that his entire billionaire lifestyle was funded by stealing pension funds from working-class families. Julian wept openly in the courtroom when the gavel fell, sentencing him to 5 hard years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His desperate pleas for a lighter sentence echoed off the oak-paneled walls, entirely ignored by the very justice system his family used to buy. But the true tragedy, in the eyes of the city's high society, was the spectacular, humiliating fall of Beatrice Sterling. The eviction notice from my property management company was delivered to her the very next morning by 2 armed county sheriffs. The woman who had spent her entire life looking down her aristocratic nose at the working class was forcibly removed from the grand foyer of Sterling Manor. I made sure my legal team monitored the proceedings closely to ensure she did not take a single crystal chandelier or vintage painting that rightfully belonged to my estate. With her bank accounts frozen and her assets seized by the government to pay off Julian's countless victims, Beatrice was left with nothing but a few designer suitcases full of outdated clothes. The exclusive country club she had practically lived at immediately revoked her lifetime membership. The charity boards she once chaired wiped her name from their letterheads overnight, erasing her existence from their wealthy circles. I received detailed reports from my private investigators that Beatrice had been forced to move into a tiny, neglected, subsidized apartment complex in the industrial district of the city. The elite social circle she had ruled with an iron fist completely shut her out. She was a pariah forced to ride the public bus wearing dark sunglasses and a heavy scarf, desperately hiding from the very people she used to command like servants. Her fake diamonds and empty status could no longer shield her from the brutal reality of the poverty she so deeply despised. The collateral damage naturally extended to my own bloodline, hitting them with the exact force they deserved. Chloe's fairy tale wedding had permanently morphed into a financial nightmare of epic proportions. The engagement was not just canceled, it was entirely obliterated the moment Julian was shoved into the back of the federal cruiser. But the real poetic justice lay in how my mother and sister had funded their pathetic high society charade. Vivian and Chloe had been so absolutely certain of Julian's limitless wealth that they had secretly taken out massive high-interest loans from notoriously predatory lenders to pay for the extravagant wedding upgrades, the designer dresses, the champagne fountains, and the first-class flights. They had bet their entire existence on a criminal's empty promises, expecting Julian to pay off the debt the morning after the wedding. The loan sharks did not care about Chloe's shredded Vera Wang gown or Vivian's shattered dreams. They simply wanted their money. The aggressive collection calls started within a week, ringing their phones at all hours of the day and night. Chloe tried desperately to sell the torn remnants of her wedding dress and the fake diamond jewelry Beatrice had gifted her, only to discover the stones were entirely synthetic. Vivian's carefully constructed image in our local community shattered overnight. She returned to her Sunday church service expecting to garner sympathy as the tragic victim of a con artist, but found only cold shoulders and whispered mockery. The women she had desperately tried to impress with her tales of billionaire in-laws and private jets now actively avoided her in the grocery store aisles. They were the laughingstock of the neighborhood, exposed as desperate, greedy social climbers who had been conned by their own blinding vanity. Unable to make the payments on their multiple loans, the bank finally foreclosed on their house. They were forced to pack their cheap imitations of luxury into black garbage bags and vacate the premises entirely bankrupt, both financially and morally, moving into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. I sat on my plush velvet sofa, the bright morning sunlight casting a warm golden glow across the imported hardwood floors of my sanctuary. My phone vibrated aggressively on the glass coffee table, disrupting the perfect quiet of my home. The screen lit up, displaying a relentless stream of notifications. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of frantic text messages. They were all from Vivian and Chloe. I picked up the device, reading the preview banners with absolute clinical detachment. The messages were a pathetic, predictable cycle of emotional manipulation. They started with blazing anger, demanding to know how I could be so cruel and heartless to my own flesh and blood. Then they shifted to heavy guilt trips, reminding me that we were family and that family was supposed to stick together through the hard times. Finally, they descended into pure, desperate groveling. Vivian sent paragraphs of fake crocodile tears, swearing she had always loved me more than anything and begging for just a fraction of my wealth to save them from living on the street. Chloe sent photos of her eviction notice, asking if she could move into one of my guest rooms and promising to be a good sister. I did not feel a single ounce of anger reading their desperate pleas. I did not feel sadness or guilt or triumph. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound, liberating apathy. They were complete strangers to me now. I pressed a sequence of buttons on my screen, permanently deleting the message threads without reading the rest. I navigated to my settings and completely deactivated my current phone number, initiating a transfer to a secure private line that only my executive team possessed. I set the phone down and picked up my house tablet, tapping the icon to connect directly to the building's head of security down in the main lobby. I transmitted 2 photographs to the security desk, one of Vivian and one of Chloe. I gave explicit instructions that these 2 women were permanently banned from the premises and that the police should be called immediately for trespassing if they ever stepped foot near the revolving glass doors. I closed the tablet and leaned back into the soft cushions, letting out a long, slow breath. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried since childhood was completely gone. I looked around my quiet, beautiful home, built entirely by my own hands, my own intellect, and my own sheer will. I had stepped over their cruelty, their neglect, and their vanity, and used it all to forge an empire. I let the silence of the penthouse wash over me, completely untouched by the chaos they were drowning in. I was finally completely, undeniably free. Freedom, I quickly realized, was not just the absence of their toxicity, but the quiet, uninterrupted peace of knowing the universe had finally balanced the scales. A few days after I blocked their numbers and permanently secured my penthouse against their intrusion, the final comprehensive dossier from my private investigator arrived on my encrypted server. I opened the file and read through the granular details of their descent. The brief summary I had known was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing reality of their daily nightmare. Chloe and Vivian had not simply borrowed money from a standard bank to fund their lavish society charade. Traditional lenders required proof of income, a solid credit history, and substantial collateral, which neither of them possessed. Driven by blinding greed and an absolute certainty that Julian Sterling's billionaire status would cover their tracks, they had ventured into the darkest corners of the city's financial underworld. They had gone to a ruthless shadow lender operating out of a heavily guarded office in the industrial district. They signed away everything on a massive short-term bridge loan with astronomically predatory daily interest rates. They fully expected to pay it off the morning after the wedding, using Julian's limitless black card. When Julian was arrested and his assets were immediately seized by the federal government, the shadow lenders did not send polite past due notices in the mail. They sent two massive, intimidating enforcers directly to the front door of Vivian's house. The men did not bother to knock. They pounded aggressively on the heavy oak door, demanding immediate repayment for the hundreds of thousands of dollars borrowed for champagne towers, imported white orchids, and custom-tailored silk suits. Chloe had frantically offered them the extravagant diamond necklace Beatrice Sterling had given her as an engagement gift, begging them to take it as collateral. One of the enforcers had a professional jeweler examine it right there in the living room. The stones were entirely worthless cubic zirconia set in cheap plated metal. The men scoffed at the fake jewelry and immediately seized Chloe's least luxury SUV right out of the driveway. They left her standing on the curb in her silk pajamas, weeping hysterically as her primary symbol of high society status was driven away. Vivian's destruction was far more public and infinitely more humiliating. Her entire identity was wrapped up in her standing at the elite community church where she had spent years looking down on congregants she deemed less wealthy or less fashionable. The Sunday after Julian's highly publicized arrest, Vivian attempted to employ her usual strategy of arrogant denial. She dressed in her best imitation Chanel suit, styled her hair perfectly, and marched into the church sanctuary, expecting to be treated like a tragic victim of circumstance. She strutted down the center aisle with her chin held high, heading straight for her usual front-row pew. Instead of sympathetic hugs and comforting whispers, she was met with an impenetrable wall of icy stares. The wealthy women she had spent months bragging to about her daughter's billionaire fiancé actively turned their backs as she approached. People physically shifted away from her in the pews. After the service during the weekly coffee hour in the fellowship hall, Vivian desperately tried to corner Margaret Hastings, the affluent head of the church's charity board. Vivian forced a bright smile and began a rehearsed speech about how Chloe was bravely handling the shock of Julian's deception. Margaret did not smile back. She loudly informed Vivian that the church administration had been contacted by federal authorities regarding the massive fraudulent donation pledges Vivian had publicly made in Julian's name. Margaret explicitly demanded that Vivian step down from the charity committee immediately and suggested, with dripping condescension, that she find another place of worship. The entire congregation watched in absolute profound silence as Vivian, her face burning with unparalleled humiliation, walked out the heavy doors for the last time. Her social currency was entirely bankrupt and her reputation was permanently reduced to ash. The financial ruin quickly caught up to their physical reality. Unable to make the mortgage payments for 6 consecutive months, Vivian had been hiding the bank's warning letters in a desperate state of denial. The illusion shattered completely on a brisk Tuesday morning. The bank's foreclosure representatives arrived, accompanied by local county sheriffs, to execute the final eviction. Vivian and Chloe were given exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises. The upscale neighborhood they had desperately tried to impress now became the captivated audience to their ultimate disgrace. Neighbors stood on their manicured lawns, watching openly as Vivian and Chloe frantically stuffed their cheap imitation designer clothes and synthetic jewelry into black plastic garbage bags. There were no professional moving trucks or polite packers, just 2 desperate women dragging heavy trash bags across the pristine lawn they no longer owned. The sheriff officially changed the lock, slamming the front door shut and sealing away their delusions of grandeur forever. Stripped of their home, their cars, and their social standing, they had nowhere else to turn. The elite friends they had cultivated immediately blocked their phone numbers. They were forced to rent a cramped, damp room in a notorious pay-by-the-week motel on the very edge of the city limits. The investigators' photographs showed the stark, depressing reality of their new existence. The motel room featured peeling yellow wallpaper, a single stained mattress, and a flickering neon sign outside the window that buzzed loudly through the night, casting a sickly red glow across the cheap linoleum floor. Chloe, The girl who had once demanded imported caviar and private jets now spent her days working double shifts at a greasy fast food diner just to afford the weekly motel rent and the basic groceries they needed to survive. Her hands, once perfectly manicured and soft, were now constantly blistered and burned from the deep fryer. She returned to the damp motel room every night smelling of stale cooking oil and cheap bleach, weeping over the shattered fragments of her completely fake fairy tale. Vivian, who had arrogantly refused to work a day in her life out of sheer entitlement, was forced to confront the ultimate indignity. Desperate to keep them from starving, she had to take a job cleaning rooms at that very same motel. The woman who had treated service workers like invisible dirt was now pushing a heavy housekeeping cart down the dingy hallways, scrubbing toilets and washing stained linens for minimum wage. Her back ached, her hands were raw from harsh chemicals, and her spirit was entirely broken. I closed the digital dossier on my tablet and deleted the file permanently. There was no need to keep it, and no desire to ever look at it again. The scales of justice were perfectly balanced. I walked over to the expansive glass windows of my penthouse, looking out over the vibrant city that was now mine to conquer. I had built my empire on relentless hard work, brilliant strategy, and unwavering integrity. They had tried to build theirs on empty lies, cruel manipulation, and the theft of other people's wealth. The universe had simply course-corrected. I turned away from the window, ready to step into the bright future I had earned, leaving them entirely in the shadows of the past where they truly belonged. The absolute silence that followed the deactivation of my old phone number was the most exquisite sound I had ever heard. It was not a heavy, isolating silence, but rather a profound, resonant peace. For the first time in my 32 years of existence, I was completely untethered from the relentless gravitational pull of their toxicity. I spent that entire first weekend enveloped in the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse. I did not check social media. I did not turn on the television to see the latest updates on the Sterling family's catastrophic ruin. I simply existed. I drank black coffee on my wraparound terrace, watching the city wake up beneath me. I read thick architecture books that had been sitting untouched on my shelves for months. I slept deeply and without the chronic tension that had permanently knotted my shoulders since childhood. The suffocating anxiety of anticipating their next crisis, their next demand for money, or their next cruel comparison had vanished entirely. My newly acquired private line remained blissfully quiet, known only to my senior executives and my personal attorney. There were no manipulative paragraphs masking as apologies. There were no frantic voicemails begging for a financial bailout. There was only the calm, steady rhythm of a life I had built entirely on my own terms. Of course, I knew their desperation would not easily be contained to the digital realm. People like Vivian and Chloe, who had spent their entire lives treating others as disposable stepping stones, did not understand the concept of a closed door. They genuinely believed that their bloodline granted them an all-access pass to my assets regardless of how thoroughly they had abused me. Their sense of entitlement was a terminal disease. 5 days after their humiliating public eviction from their foreclosed home, my secure line buzzed. It was Marcus, the head of my building's private security detail. His voice was strictly professional, but carried a note of cautious urgency as he informed me of a situation unfolding in the main lobby. Without a word, I tapped the security application on my tablet, bringing up the live closed-circuit camera feed. I watched the high-definition video play out like a silent documentary about a completely alien species. There they were, Vivian and Chloe standing in the pristine marble lobby of my residential tower. They looked incredibly disheveled, a stark contrast to the perfectly curated images they used to present to the world. Chloe's hair was tied back in a messy knot, and she was wearing a faded trench coat that looked like it had been hastily pulled from a garbage bag. Vivian looked aged, her posture stooped as she argued aggressively with the front desk concierge. I watched with absolute clinical detachment as Chloe gestured wildly, pointing upward toward the penthouses while Vivian attempted to physically push past the velvet security ropes. It was a pathetic display. They were throwing a tantrum attempting to utilize their trademark aristocratic outrage in a place where their names held absolutely zero currency. The footage showed Marcus stepping forward flanked by two massive security guards. They moved smoothly, intercepting my mother and sister before they could bypass the desk. I could not hear the audio, but the body language was unmistakably clear. Marcus was calmly informing them of their permanently banned status. Vivian's face contorted into an ugly mask of rage. She pointed a shaking finger at Marcus, clearly threatening to cause a massive scandal, demanding to see her daughter. Marcus did not flinch. He simply pulled a radio from his belt and signaled for local law enforcement. The video feed concluded 10 minutes later, showing two uniformed city police officers firmly escorting Vivian and Chloe out through the revolving glass doors and into the pouring rain. They were officially trespassed from the property, facing immediate arrest if they ever returned. Marcus called back a few moments later, formally apologizing for the disturbance. I thanked him for his exceptional professionalism and instructed my financial team to ensure a substantial bonus was immediately added to his next paycheck and to the guards who assisted him. As I closed the security application, I waited for the familiar pang of familial guilt to strike. I waited for the conditioned response that told me I was a terrible daughter and an ungrateful sister for allowing my own flesh and blood to be thrown out into the street by police. But the guilt never materialized. I searched my chest for a shred of sympathy and found it entirely empty. I felt nothing but a cool, sweeping relief. The diseased limb had been completely amputated, and the wound was finally beginning to heal. Freed from the massive emotional anchor of their constant demands and their insidious psychological warfare, my focus sharpened with lethal precision. My real estate development firm entered a period of unprecedented, explosive expansion. In the weeks that followed their eviction, I personally closed 3 major commercial acquisitions in the downtown financial district. We broke ground on a massive, eco-friendly residential complex that would completely redefine the city's skyline. I walked through the glass corridors of my corporate headquarters, surrounded by a team of brilliant architects, ruthless negotiators, and financial analysts who respected me implicitly. They did not care about my lack of high society grace. They did not whisper about my quiet demeanor. They respected my intellect, my vision, and my absolute refusal to fail. I sat at the head of the boardroom table listening to quarterly profit reports that exceeded every projection, and I realized a fundamental truth. The massive amount of mental energy I used to waste trying to earn my family's conditional love was now being poured directly into building a tangible, lasting legacy. Every cruel comment my mother had ever made about my inadequacy had been repurposed into high-octane fuel for my ambition. I had taken the bricks they threw at me and used them to build an impenetrable fortress. The juxtaposition of our lives became the ultimate poetic justice. I did not seek out information about their new reality, but the details occasionally filtered through my legal team, who monitored the ongoing fallout of the Sterling criminal case. Julian Sterling was officially transferred to a federal penitentiary where he would spend the next 5 years trading his extravagant lifestyle for a concrete cell. Beatrice Sterling, the former queen of the city's elite, was completely erased from high society, struggling to survive on meager government assistance in a dilapidated apartment complex. And my mother and sister were trapped in the exact nightmare they had always mocked. The local tabloids had completely lost interest in them, realizing they were nothing more than collateral damage in a much larger scandal. They were relegated to the shadows, working grueling minimum wage shifts at grease-stained diners and cleaning cheap motel rooms just to survive. They were forced to ride the public transit they had once despised, hiding their faces in shame. They had worshipped money and status with a religious fervor, and the universe had stripped them of both, leaving them with nothing but the brutal reality of their own incompetence. I returned home late one evening after a triumphant board meeting. The city was transitioning into dusk, the sky painted in brilliant shades of bruised purple and vibrant orange. I poured a glass of expensive vintage red wine and stepped out onto the expansive terrace. The crisp wind caught my hair, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt from the streets far below. I looked down at the sprawling metropolis, watching millions of tiny lights flicker to life as the city prepared for the night. For 30 years, I had allowed two deeply flawed people to dictate my worth. I had internalized their endless comparisons, their dismissive sighs, and their blatant favoritism. I had believed the toxic narrative that I was the broken one, the awkward daughter who needed to be fixed, hidden, or managed. Now standing high above the empire I had conquered, I understood the profound, beautiful truth. They were the ones who were fundamentally broken. Their entire existence relied on a fragile, pathetic house of cards built from vanity, deception, and the desperate need for external validation. The moment a real storm hit, their entire world collapsed into dust. I raised my glass to the glittering skyline, offering a silent, solitary toast to the quiet little girl who used to hide in her room reading books while her sister was paraded around like a prize. That little girl had survived the fire. She had navigated the treacherous waters of their emotional abuse and emerged completely unscathed. She had built an empire from the ground up, and she was finally unequivocally thriving. The past was a closed chapter, a book I would never open again. I took a sip of the rich, dark wine, turning my back to the city lights, and walked inside my quiet, beautiful home, entirely ready for tomorrow. I walked over to the custom mahogany bar situated at the far end of the expansive living space. The smooth, cool marble beneath my fingertips grounded me in the present reality of my success. I reached for a bottle of vintage Bordeaux, a rare and highly coveted year that I had purchased specifically for a moment of absolute triumph. I poured the dark crimson liquid into a heavy crystal glass, watching how the ambient lighting of the penthouse caught the rich ruby color. Taking the glass in my hand, I moved slowly back toward the center of the room, letting the profound silence of my sanctuary wrap around me like a protective cloak. The transition from the unwanted outcast to the apex predator of my own life was now entirely complete. I thought about the decades I had spent hopelessly seeking validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. I thought about the endless, exhausting cycle of trying to prove my basic human worth to a mother who only saw me as a flawed reflection of her own deep insecurities, and a sister who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient stepping stone for her own pathetic ambitions. The reflection in the massive floor-to-ceiling window caught my gaze once again. I stepped closer to the pane until the sprawling, glittering city lights became a blurred, abstract backdrop to my own face. My eyes stared back at me, stripped of all the old childhood fears and the lingering, desperate doubts. The hesitant, anxious girl who used to shrink away from their harsh words and cruel dismissals was completely gone. In her place stood a woman forged in the fire of their rejection, holding absolute, unyielding authority over her own destiny. The gaze reflected in the glass was sharp, commanding, and entirely free. I looked deeply into my own eyes, recognizing the sheer power radiating from within. There was no more pain, no more longing for a maternal love that never truly existed. The emotional poison of my bloodline had been completely drained from my veins. I raised the crystal glass slightly, holding it up as a silent, solitary salute to the skyline. My mind drifted back to that single defining night so many years ago. The clinking of fine silverware, the arrogant high society laughter, the suffocating, cloying smell of my mother's heavy designer perfume. I vividly recalled the distinct, burning humiliation of being physically banished from the main dining room. I remembered the cold draft in the hallway, where they had placed my small, isolated table, treating me like an unsightly secret that needed to be hidden away from their wealthy, influential guests. They had explicitly communicated my lack of worth. They had collectively decided I did not belong in their glamorous world. I looked at my reflection and let the absolute truth of the moment wash over me. They called me the black sheep. They seated me in the hallway because they thought I was not worthy. But they forgot one crucial, undeniable thing. A wolf never needs a seat at the table with puppets. My family had spent their entire lives performing a tragic, desperate play, They danced on invisible strings pulled by societal expectations, greedy ambitions, and the desperate gnawing need for status and external validation. They were empty, hollow vessels wearing designer clothing, performing for an audience of equally hollow people. I had spent years crying over not being invited to participate in their pathetic little show. I had wasted so much invaluable energy trying to explain myself, trying to earn a role in a production that was always fundamentally doomed to fail. You do not need to try to change the minds of toxic blood relatives. You do not need to argue with their delusions or exhaust yourself trying to prove your intrinsic value to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding you. You just need to buy the stage where they are putting on their act and turn off the lights. And that is exactly what I had done. I had not just defeated them in some petty familial rivalry, I had systematically dismantled the very foundation of their false reality. By utilizing my intellect and outmaneuvering them in the brutal corporate arena, I had stripped away the wealth and status they worshipped above all else. I had exposed the absolute rotting emptiness of their existence for the entire world to witness. The darkness they now stumbled through, the cheap motel rooms and the grueling minimum wage shifts, was entirely of their own making. I had simply flipped the switch and let the terrifying reality of their own incompetence consume them. A sharp, cold smile touched my lips, altering the reflection in the glass. It was a smile of pure, lethal satisfaction. I brought the crystal glass to my mouth and drank the rich, heavy wine, tasting the complex, dark notes of victory and ultimate closure. The warmth spread through my chest, a final physical confirmation that the ghosts of my past could no longer touch me. I turned away from the sweeping, magnificent view of the city and walked slowly, deliberately, toward the heavy double doors of my private office. The room inside was a perfectly curated sanctuary of immense corporate power. The massive desk, carved from a single piece of dark walnut, was neatly organized, waiting for my attention. Stacked carefully in the exact center of the leather blotter were 3 new, massive acquisition files. These were not just simple everyday business deals. They were multi-million-dollar contracts, representing the hostile, aggressive takeover of the very financial institutions that had once confidently rejected my initial business loans. I was not just participating in the corporate world, I was actively conquering it, reshaping the entire financial district to fit my exact vision. I set the empty crystal glass on the polished edge of the desk and rested my hands flat on the leather surface. The ambient, sophisticated lighting of the penthouse cast long, dramatic shadows across the room, highlighting the sharp angles of the modern architecture. I stood there, bathed in the quiet, magnificent glow of my own undeniable success. Slowly, the vibrant, glowing city lights outside the massive windows seemed to dim in comparison to the brilliant, limitless future awaiting me inside these walls. I walked around the desk, my footsteps completely silent on the thick imported rug, and took my seat in the high-backed leather chair. I opened the first heavy portfolio, my eyes scanning the bold, precise print of the acquisition contract. The room around me was perfectly still, perfectly secure, and entirely mine. As I picked up my custom-engraved fountain pen to sign the first page, initiating the transfer of millions of dollars, the surrounding shadows seemed to embrace the edges of the room. The visual periphery began to pull back, retreating into a profound and absolute peaceful darkness, leaving only the bright, undeniable reality of my ultimate triumph illuminating the desk. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that family is a title earned through respect, not a life sentence dictated by blood. For years, I allowed their toxic expectations to define my worth. They called me the black sheep. They seated me out in the hallway because they thought I was not worthy of their elite circles. But they forgot one crucial detail. A wolf never needs to beg for a seat at a table filled with puppets. I realized that you do not need to try to change the minds of toxic blood relatives. You do not need to waste your breath fighting their delusions or begging for their validation. You simply need to buy the stage where they are performing their pathetic little act and turn off the lights. Toxic people do not want to see your value. They only want to maintain their control. True power comes from walking away and building an undeniable reality on your own terms. Healing is not about malicious revenge. It is about ultimate reclamation. Walking away from their abuse is the highest form of self-love. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys of reclaiming your true power.